Welcome to No More Risk. Today I'd like to talk about the 4 types of water-based sprinkler systems: wet, dry, deluge, and pre-action. The simplest, the most reliable, and the most common is the wet system. The piping is completely filled with water all the way to the sprinkler, and when it actuates, it's putting water on the fire. It has the least amount of trim piping around the valve. It will have a means to indicate water flow. It could be a red box on the pipe, or in this case, a pressure switch. One of the easy ways to tell you're looking at a wet system is there'll typically be 2 gauges and the pressure will be very much the same. It has one drawback. You can't use a wet system in an area subject to freezing. So one of the choices is we use a dry system. Now, the dry system has something called a dry pipe valve, where the water is from the middle down and air is from the middle up. When the sprinkler operates, the air bleeds off, the valve trips, and then the water makes its way to the fire. That gives the fire a head start because there is a delay for that to happen, but it's still an effective approach in those unheated areas. The easiest way to identify a dry pipe valve is it might tell you it is one. The gauges will read different pressures, typically about a 3-to-1 ratio. We can see the water pressure is 120 psi and the air pressure is 40 psi. It too will have a water flow alarm to tell us that we have a trip, and it also may have a low air pressure switch to tell us that we're losing some air. But the gauges and what's on the front of it might be all you need to know. Now, the other type of system we have right here is a deluge system. The thing about a deluge system is it has an independent means of detection. It could be heat detection, line-type heat detection, smoke detection, UV-IR flame detection, a pilot line of sprinklers filled with air or nitrogen. And whenever that detection system says there's a fire, it will trip the valve and send water to either open sprinklers or open nozzles. The other thing about a deluge system is you can always operate it manually. There will be something that says, in case of fire, push me, pull me, or turn me. Right here and right here. Otherwise, the detection system simply operates as solenoid and the water's on its way. Now, a pre-action system is identical to everything I've said about the deluge system, except it uses closed sprinklers instead of open sprinklers or open nozzles. Otherwise, all the principles of operation are exactly the same. It all comes down to whether you have an open or closed sprinkler. So there we have it, wet, dry, deluge, pre-action. Today I'd like to talk to you about dry sprinkler systems, and specifically the dry pipe valve. Whenever we have unheated areas subject to freezing, we can't use a wet system, and the most common alternative then becomes the dry system. The dry pipe valve is where the air and the water meet. We have air from here up, water from here down. Now, the operating concept is reasonably simple. We have what we call differential pressure. That means less air pressure on the top will hold back more water pressure on the bottom. And the reason is that the air has a larger area to act on. If it was in service, we would see an air pressure of about 40 psi and a water pressure of about 120 psi. What happens when there's a fire is it opens sprinklers on the piping and it begins to lose air. And as it loses air and the pressure drops, it reaches a point where it can no longer hold the water back. And that ratio is about 5.5 to 1 from the water pressure to the air pressure. And at that point, when it can no longer hold it back, the water pressure forces the clapper to the open position. And now the water, with the full water pressure behind it, is headed to the fire area. At the same time, there's a groove in here between the 2 seats that clapper sealed. It's called an intermediate chamber. And the water goes in the intermediate chamber. It actually comes out of the back of the valve, and it goes through a pipe up to this pressure switch. This is our water flow alarm. As soon as it senses water pressure, we're going to get our alarm. Now, the other stuff that needs to be on a valve so that it does everything we need to operate the way I described it, we need an air supply because we need to maintain that air pressure. We need to have an ability to put some water on top of the clapper on many of these valves, and it's called priming water. This is the priming cup. We would actually use this once it's closed up to pour water to this level. There's another valve back here that we can use to make sure the priming water is at the correct level. We obviously need to have a drain so we can drain the system down. There's also an air pressure switch. In the event there was an air leak on the system, we'd want to know about it before this thing tripped. It may or may not have something called an accelerator. What it does is it takes some of the stored energy of that air in the piping when it first senses the pressure loss, and it redirects it into the intermediate chamber to force the clapper open faster than it otherwise would. And then that gets the water on the way to the fire more quickly. So that's the key principles behind a dry system. This lower air pressure holding back higher water pressure until you lose the air, clapper opens, water goes to the fire, alarm rings. The key thing is this needs some tender loving care to make sure it's going to do the job in a fire. There's really two basic configurations of wet sprinkler systems. And today I'd like to focus on the riser check valve that also uses a water flow alarm. Now, the riser check valve is just a check valve with a drain. And we can tell that our water pressure is about the same on both gauges. If we pulled this riser check valve apart, what you would see is there's just a clapper that when the water flows, it lifts up. Now, when it goes past the water flow alarm, if we take the red cover off that box on the pipe and pull it out of the pipe, what we see is this paddle. And when the water flows past it, it lifts the paddle, and that makes a contact here to send the alarm. Now, there is an adjustment screw for a time delay, and that's so that small bumps in water pressure don't give you a false alarm. Anytime you see the water flow alarm, the red box on the pipe, it's a wet system, because every other type of system would have a slug of water going up through that pipe when the valve tripped, and that could damage this or maybe even break it off and plug downstream piping. So you'll only see the water flow alarm, the red box on the pipe, on a wet system. So those are the two key components. To do an alarm test, you would typically go to the end of the system and find the inspector's test connection. It would have a broken off sprinkler head of the same orifice size as what's installed on the system. We also have an inspector's test connection at the riser that has the exact same size orifice as the system, which in our case, it says ELO. That means K11.2 or K160 metric. So when we turn this handle, we're simulating water flow out of any sprinkler in the system, and that should be sufficient to give us an alarm. So let's do it. And there we have our alarm. So now I'll close the valve slowly so we don't trap too much water pressure. And that's it. We have a wet system using a riser check valve and a water flow alarm. We've just done the alarm test by simulating one sprinkler going off through the inspector's test connection. Now it's time for me to go shut the alarm off. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on No More Risk.